everybody. I'm Jennifer Pahlka, formerly of Code for America and U.S. Digital Service, and I'm here today feeling very lucky to be able to have a wonderful conversation with Jill Habig and hopefully also with some of you. So Jill and I are going to talk for about 20 minutes. And if questions come up for you, for Jill, please put them into the Q&A section and we'll try to get to them. We're just really looking forward to this. Hi, Jill, say hi to everybody.
Hi, it's so great to be with you, Jen, and really excited to talk to everybody.
Yeah, great. So I just wanted to tell people first how I met you, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
It's sort of why we're very much on the same page these days about a particular issue that I think people don't really understand as deeply as they should, especially if they care about change in the world. And I'm guessing that everybody who's tuned in today cares about changing something in this world, probably through law and policy. So I was working at Code for America, and I was getting my own sort of education in what I now call the delivery gap or the implementation gap, because a wonderful woman named Jenny Montoya Tansey had helped us start a project, or she really started this project at Code for America, which was recognizing that the fact that California had changed its laws about what was criminal and what wasn't. And so you had a bunch of people, dings. You had a bunch of people who had felonies on their record for things that were really no longer a crime. And yet the people who had those criminal records were not getting them expunged from their, so when they went to get a job or job interview or try to get housing, they still showed up as former felons, and it was hugely, hugely detrimental to their lives. So Jenny had this wonderful project that goes on, still today, to actually close that gap between the intentions of our laws and the actual outcome of those laws. That's accelerated hugely, in part because when this all started, we had Prop 47, which had decriminalized some things, but now we've had massive decriminalization of marijuana, and yet still so many people don't get the benefit of getting that off their record. So while we were doing this project, Jenny said, I want to bring in a speaker for the Code for America staff, and her name is Jill Habig, and she's starting something called the Public Rights Project. And I said, great, bring her in. And she talked about how this is not an isolated problem, but in fact, a really huge problem that affects everything that we think of as change in this country. And so why don't we start, Jill, with just I've talked about something I call the delivery gap, and it's really sort of this idea that you pass a law, but it sort of doesn't get implemented. Your work is focused on this idea that you pass a law and it doesn't get enforced. So what's the best example, just to bring that to life for people? What is the implementation gap to you? What's the project that most illustrates it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So, I think the biggest example that is most kind of omnipresent right now in American life is around workers' rights and wage theft, workers who don't get all of the money that they're owed. So if everybody remembers, this has been now over probably a 15-year campaign. There was the Fight for 15, right? There have been organizers across the country and cities across the country, dozens of cities and states as well, organizing to pass a $15 minimum wage. Workers have also been organizing to pass paid sick leave at the state and local level, or other worker benefits and protections for low-wage workers in particular. It's been a huge success. There are dozens of cities across the country that now have a $15 minimum wage, that have all these new worker protections. And yet we still have 1 in 5 at the lowest end count. 1 in 5 low-wage workers are making less than minimum wage. So in particular, just to share one specific example, in Oakland, 82% of Oakland voters passed a worker protection ordinance in 2015. And yet just a couple years later, exactly, Oakland, where I live. And yet, this woman named Matilda Cortez, who was a housekeeper at the Quality Inn by the Oakland airport. Anyone who's ever flown in or out of Oakland has driven by this hotel, big national chain. And she and all of her coworkers were forced to work off the clock for years. They didn't get sick leave. They didn't get rest breaks or meal breaks. They didn't get the protective gear they were, entitled to when they were doing dangerous work, like using chemicals to clean rooms and things like that. And they were scared. They were threatened with retaliation if they complained. They had nowhere to go, and they weren't actually getting the benefit of the law that 82% of Oakland voters had voted to pass. What it took was actually the Oakland City Attorney's Office partnering with a local community organization to actually sue the Quality Inn, force them to give the workers the back pay they were owed, force them to change their policies so that future workers would actually get the pay and conditions that they were owed, and set a precedent across the city for employers that with this law is on the books, but it's more than just sitting on a piece of paper. It is actually going to become real for workers, and we're going to make sure that we hold companies accountable if they're not following this law. So that just one example with 6 or 7 housekeepers is the same as what it is being experienced by millions of workers across the country. And if we don't actually have resources at the state and local level to enforce the laws that advocates have organized to pass over all of these years, then we're leaving the promise of those laws unfulfilled.
So you worked with the city attorney of Oakland to file this lawsuit. What's on the table for these city attorneys and others that are supposed to enforce these laws? Like, is this easy for them?
Yeah, I wish.
Softball question, obviously.
I know, right? I wish. So this is not rocket science, but it also isn't easy. It's one of those classic problems that we have. There's this authority sitting there that state and local governments can use, but they haven't actually been given the resources or the training or the information that they need to actually make use of it. So I think about it in terms of 3 things. They need people, the right people in the right jobs. They need skills. Like a lot of times when these new laws are passed, there's no budget for training or hiring new people. If you have a new workers' rights law or a new tenant protection law, if you don't have folks in the city who have already done housing work or workers' rights work, that's a new skill they have to learn, and they can learn it, but it doesn't just happen overnight. So they need skills. And then the biggest thing that we actually see, and I think this is really big for the Ashoka Network and other advocates to think about, is they need information in order to actually enforce these laws. So going back to the Matilda example, the city attorney's office probably never would have heard from Matilda herself. There were a lot of immigrant workers. They were scared. Some of them may have been undocumented or mixed status. They don't trust the city. A lot of communities don't trust the city or the government for good reason, right? We're talking about governments that have a really sordid history and present of marginalizing communities, of perpetuating violence against communities of color. And so there's this history of mistrust and just lack of information. A random, a regular minimum wage worker at a retail store isn't going to think about their DA or their city attorney as a place that they can go for help, nor would most people. And so what it took was actually the city attorney having a relationship with a community-based organization. Right. Those workers trusted Centro Legal de la Raza in Oakland. And Centro Legal had a relationship with the city attorney's office. And so what we see often across the country is even when state and local governments are willing to listen, they want to do the right thing, they don't actually have the relationship set up with community-based organizations to actually get the information they need to bring these cases. They need, workers or tenants who can come forward about their landlords, about their employers, et cetera. And that takes, again, it's not rocket science, but it takes time and real intention to build those relationships and make sure that workers are empowered to bring information forth to the government.
Yeah, I feel like that was such a lesson for me when I started Code for America. I just really didn't realize how much happens at the state and local level and how little people really understand what happens at which level of government, right? Like, your point, would Matilda have known to go to the city attorney? Would any of us have known to go to the city attorney?
No.
And then you have the trust
issue.
issue.
No one would know.
Who has jurisdiction over this? Where would I even file a complaint? Who is really there to help me? And I do think that, I do think that people need to really think about, we have such an eye focused on that federal government, and yet your work is so impactful working with states and cities. Oh, we've lost.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, good. We've got your.
No, I'm here. I'm sorry. This is the classic work from home scenario. I think our power just went out, so I'm on audio for a second. I should be back on video in a minute. But
well, I'm in Oakland too, so I hope my power doesn't go out too.
I hope so. Okay, fingers crossed that it was just us for a moment. So I mean, I think that, again, I think the history is really instructive here. Especially progressive advocates have thought historically about the federal government as the place where they go to make sure that their rights are protected. Mm-hmm. And there's a really good reason for that when we think about Reconstruction, the civil rights movement, Jim Crow laws, et cetera. States' rights really has a negative connotation for good reason as a conservative, anti-civil rights, anti-racial justice kind of issue. But I think what's happened is that that's a little bit outdated now. It doesn't have to be that way. And that we actually have a lot of potential at the state and local level to amplify the work of movement building and to actually use government power for good in communities that are organizing for change. And so I think we really miss an opportunity to do that. If we only look to the federal government, we're missing, 50 states and thousands of local governments that we could be mobilizing to protect people's rights.
Absolutely. And I just, the national media and the collapse of local media doesn't help with this. There's so many things that focus us in places where we miss that opportunity. And that's one of the things I love about what Public Rights Project is doing. Give us another example of a project that you're working on now more recently.
Yeah, so another example that we have is we're working on this is another workers' rights example. We're working on a campaign against a company called Handy, which if folks are following a lot of the issues with respect to gig workers and gig platforms like Uber and Lyft and Instacart. Handy workers are basically domestic workers who are hired through a gig platform. So you can go onto Handy, you can hire a house cleaner, you can hire a handyman or woman, hence the Handy name. And what we found is when we were talking to workers and community advocates that a lot of Handy workers were not making minimum wage. They were being fined for leaving unsafe job sites, including jobs where they were sexually harassed. And instead of being protected when they left those unsafe sites, they were actually fined by the company for leaving the job or not finishing the job. They were denied sick leave when they had COVID. And other things like that. They were, fined for canceling jobs when they were sick during a pandemic. And so we've actually been organizing workers and local governments to take action against the company and to enforce all of the laws that the company is violating. So again, looking back to all these cities that have minimum wage laws, lots of cities have paid sick leave laws. And they were just not being enforced. And so we're working with a number of cities across the country, including San Francisco and LA and Chicago, to hold Handy accountable for their misconduct and get workers both the money and the protection that they're owed.
Yeah, that's amazing. It seems sort of shocking, and then of course you realize that if there's no enforcement, of course that's going to happen.
Exactly.
You worked for 4 years with the woman who is now our vice president. Oh, great, you're back. Hi.
Sorry, that took a little minute.
No, I'm so glad to have you there. When VP Harris was the Attorney General of California, you worked with her for many years. Was that where you got sort of the idea for this, when you realized how important something like Public Rights Project would become?
Yes, I learned a lot from the vice president, but one of the biggest things that I learned from her working for her in the Attorney General's office was that so much of government is not about overcoming opposition. It's about overcoming inertia, right? We always imagine this huge, bureaucracy that opposes change when we think about the bad parts of government or things like that, or, advocates trying to change government practices and things like that. I think what she really understood was that so often change doesn't happen, not because of opposition, but because there is no champion really pushing the work forward internally. And so that's what I really learned from her. And in particular, she tasked me with starting a children's civil rights unit in California. And this was another classic example where there were laws on the books for decades protecting children's civil rights. Children in California have constitutional right to an education. They have civil rights, to protecting them against discrimination in school. They have rights against mistreatment in the juvenile justice system or the foster system. But the Attorney General's office had never enforced those laws. We've never had personnel with training to enforce those laws. We'd never had a budget or a dedicated unit to do that work. And she and I both understood that if children don't get the full benefit of their rights when they're young, if they're in the foster system, if they are racially profiled in schools and suspended early as kids of color, that sets them up for a very different life trajectory than they could have if they're actually set up to thrive. And so I actually spent 2 years building a new unit in the Attorney General's office that still stands, dedicated specifically to enforcing those laws. And that was really just a big light bulb moment for me, because we didn't have to pass a single law. There was no mobilization needed besides the decision of the Attorney General, a budget and resources, and then the sort of boots on the ground, rolling your sleeves up, building relationships with community organizations who could help us actually identify what cases were most needed. So we investigated probation departments for civil rights violations. We prosecuted a school district, a school police department for racially profiling elementary school kids. We did a lot of work on civil rights issues that the department could have been doing for decades. It just hadn't done it.
It's amazing. And you have this realization then, I've had much of the same experience. People say, well, we've got to pass a law. And you go, the law is actually there, right?
Yeah.
But, you and I have talked before about, I'm of the age that I watched Schoolhouse Rock as a kid, right?
Yes.
And there was the famous, 7-minute little thing where you learned how change happens in the United States, which is you get this little, rolled up piece of paper sitting on the Capitol Hill steps wanting, I'm a bill, but I want to become a law. And you learn how that bill becomes a law and then it ends. And if you don't do the work that Public Rights Project does and, city and state attorneys do, and for Code for America's work, it's the digital implementation. How do the data systems actually, follow up? Because it's like, it's fine if there's a law that says your criminal record is expunged in theory, but if the database says you still are a felon, you still aren't getting that job, you're still not getting that house, you're still not able to even drive your kids on a carpool at school, right? So it's this idea that law is magic words in our society, that whole thing of the bill going from just a piece of paper to becoming law is magic, right? We turn those words into magic. And yet, if you don't have the work that you're doing, that magic just disappears.
Yes. And I think we actually have, just to take a step away from law for a second, we've all lived this gap over the last 2 years, which is we had a vaccine, but we didn't have vaccinations. The vaccine is the law. We had this miracle, right, of this vaccine that was developed in a record amount of time. And then we all lived through the experience of a law that doesn't translate to reality. It's very different to have a vaccine than to actually have 350 million Americans vaccinated, right? That takes refrigerators, that takes delivery systems, that takes government personnel, that takes community resources, that takes people, you know, that is really, I think, the modern day analogy for what we think about as the enforcement gap or the delivery gap.
Well, I worked on unemployment insurance, and it's also very clear there. I mean, you saw our Congress say, let's increase unemployment insurance benefits, let's extend them to gig workers, let's do this, you know, and of course the stimulus itself, but there were all sorts of things like that. And then in California, you know, when I went to work there, I did a 6-week gig as sort of the strike team chair. They didn't even know how many were sitting in the backlog. We found 1.2 million claims in the backlog that were not getting paid. So it's like, Congress says this, but I have no check. I am on my last, you know, packet of ramen. That's what I kept hearing from. It's like, great, but it's not actually happening. So, you know, that does get.
I mean, I think another the tenant eviction, like eviction moratorium.
Yes,
if you remember hearing about during the pandemic, was another example. We had fellows across the country who were tracking these eviction moratoriums, and what most people saw, I think, in the news was huge pandemic, lots of governments actually mobilizing quickly to protect tenants from being displaced. It's a public health issue, it's an economic justice issue, it's a safety issue for people. And yet, it actually took a lot of our fellows and our government partners figuring out how to enforce those moratoriums, because lots of landlords were still trying to evict their tenants during the pandemic. There were folks who were even producing like false eviction notices from the court, even though the court was closed and they were legally barred from filing an eviction notice. So that's the kind of resources on the ground that it takes to make sure that the goals that we actually set out for ourselves and the decisions that we make actually get translated into reality on the ground for folks.
Yeah, and it's a great example of how the enforcement work and the implementation work go hand in hand, because we also had ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, that was supposed to help people with money at that time. And we had all other sorts of people saying, if we can get them the relief before they get evicted. And I think they said that right when that legislation was running out, they had only distributed 11% of the funds that Congress had allocated to help people on the other side of that problem. And, you know, those two things should have come together to really protect people, and they didn't as well as they should have. But I think that does speak to a question that a lot of people will have, which is, each one of these things takes resources. I will argue that on the digital delivery side, we're actually spinning our wheels a lot by doing things in very big, heavyweight ways with very expensive government contractors, and it's not a zero-sum game. But on the enforcement side, there's no way that you can find Matilda without people, right? Without a lot of resources. So, you know, government's not going to be able to do everything. And I think that is one thing that, you know, advocates get dinged for. I'm assuming there are a number of people who are here today. Oh, and it looks like we started to get questions, you know, who are advocates, and they want to get laws passed. What do you have to say to them? Because you see the aftermath of the advocacy, right? So what's the reality about what you see that might make advocates advocate a little differently?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think the number one thing, if advocates are advocating for or against a bill in their city council, in their state legislature, et cetera, look at what is in the bill about enforcement. Mm-hmm. How is that policy going to translate? Is there an agency that's actually charged with enforcing that law? Is there a budget in the bill to give the agency the personnel that they need to enforce that law? Is there data? That, you know, access to data is a big issue when we think about gig workers' rights or even tenant protection. Being able to actually find the owner of a property is a huge problem, even though there are lots of tenant rights bills. So if you are writing a bill or if you're advocating for a bill, pay attention to what the mechanism is for enforcing that law and the budget to enforce that law. How are people going to get in touch with the agency that's enforcing the law? Is there an opportunity to partner with community-based organizations and there are a lot of agencies that are starting to do co-enforcement, for example. So they actually give a contract to a local community-based organization to help the government enforce those laws. There are lots of different models out there, and one of the ways we work is we actually build a network of government partners across the country so that they can learn from each other. We've built a curriculum on equitable enforcement to help people just learn the playbook for how to do this kind of work. And then we do a lot of bridge building between community-based organizations and government so that they can get the information they need to address the needs of the community. Because like you said, there's no world in which we can enforce every single law 100% of the time. I don't think anyone would want to live in that world. That's kind of that's a police state. But what we do need is resources and people who can prioritize effectively, and that takes community accountability and community information. So they need to know from the community what are the most pressing needs. What is the first thing we should do if we have 3 lawyers and an investigator and a tenant rights law? Who's the worst landlord in town, or where are the tenants most at need of protection, so we can target our resources there. So that's a lot of the work that we do, and we place fellows to do that work as well. But from the advocacy side, what's the enforcement mechanism? How easy or hard is it to actually access it? What's the budget for it? Those are the main questions I would ask.
Yeah, no, that's great. And the community-based organizations sort of at least get over that trust issue. I'll also invoke another Ashoka fellow, Sixto Cancel, who works on child welfare. And I think, one of the things I've really learned from him and a lot of work in child welfare is the advocates need to make choices too, right? Like you can't, if you bog with the best of intentions, bog childcare placement down with a million different requirements, then no kids get placed, right? So how are you thinking, do you really want like the perfect, set of regulations around this, or do you want the enforceable and important ones?
Yeah. I think the other thing too, and this is stepping away from the legislative advocacy piece, but for other advocates, I think we are really good at holding elected officials and government accountable when they mess up. And we are much less strong at helping government succeed in the first place. Absolutely. So that is really, this is not at all to say that the accountability and pressure component is not needed. It's very needed. There are lots of cities, lots of states, federal government, et cetera, where protest is needed, public pressure is needed, et cetera. And there are other tools in the toolkit in terms of helping governments hire good staff with community roots and advocacy experience, building relationships with folks in the office who really want to do good work, and figuring out what is the best way to get information to your city attorney, your DA, your state attorney general, your labor standards office, et cetera, to actually address the problems that you're seeing in your community. Those levers aren't used nearly enough. And then we end up in now we need to stage a press conference, we need to stage a protest, et cetera. Yeah.
Well, we're close to time, but Amy said we could go over, and we have 3 good questions. And I want to pick up on something you just said, which is, is the city attorney's office or whatever able to hire people with good roots in the community? And that speaks to just a bigger question about sort of participation in this whole system. Nadine Free wrote a question. Jill, you recruit attorneys to partner with city and local governments. What's the draw for them to be part of this public rights movement? And more broadly, what needs to change in legal education? We don't have a ton of time, so maybe pick one of those. But I think it's a great question to talk about sort of who's part of this.
Yeah. So I think actually one of the reasons I started Public Rights Project is I had an opportunity to be a legal fellow in city government really by luck and happenstance. There was a single position available that I had lobbied the dean of our law school to create to work in city government, and then I applied for that position. That is not an equitable or replicable practice. We need to actually build pipelines into state and local government. So I think the one big thing that needs to change is that law schools need to focus more on state and local government. We spend when I was in law school, almost everything was focused on the federal courts and the federal government. And if it was state and local, it was all criminal prosecution or criminal defense. We don't learn about how to access state and local government. And I think if law schools actually taught that, if young lawyers and law students were exposed to that, I think it's a really powerful career, because you get to do public interest work with the power of government behind you. That's a really compelling thing. Being able to actually use government power for good, I think is really motivating for people. So that's what I would change.
Mikey Dickerson, who took over for me at the United States Digital Service, used to say, decisions are made by who shows up. And that's really true, I think, in the halls of government. And if the wrong people have those jobs, the wrong outcomes are going to follow. And I love working in a little plug for public service.
Yes.
Claire Founder asks, can you please talk a little bit more about the way you partner with city attorney generals or equivalent offices? Do they hire you? Do you have support from other organizations? Claire is in DC and volunteering with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Yes, another wonderful Ashoka Fellow who founded that, Jen Pahlka. And they're trying to get a domestic worker rights bill passed, but the enforcement is such a critical piece. So
yes,
your wise words.
Claire, please reach out to me. I'd love to talk. And we love NDWA. We've partnered with NDWA a lot. There are a couple ways we work with city attorneys, and state offices. We place fellows and we run training programs for folks who are in government. So we have a mid-career program for folks who are already in a city or state government office, but need more skills and professional development on how to do equitable enforcement. So we do leadership development, skills training, and really peer networking is the biggest thing that we have found is useful. A lot of these offices have like 1 or 2 lawyers in them who are new. They may be great lawyers and they may be seasoned lawyers, but they're new to doing this kind of enforcement. And so we connect them across the country. We have over 80 government partners, and they learn just as much from each other, if not more, than they learn from us. They share resources, they collaborate on cases. We also do targeted advocacy campaigns where we actually supplement the resources of offices and co-counsel with them on cases. So we're working with the city of Chicago right now on the Handy case that I mentioned. We're partnering with 9 cities in Florida right now to sue Governor DeSantis and challenge an anti-Black Lives Matter law called HB1. So we do a lot of joint advocacy with community-based organizations and local governments to help them both learn how to do these cases, but also just to supplement their resources to take on, big adversaries that they wouldn't necessarily have resources to do alone.
That's great, thanks. Another really great question, Julie Gaskin asks, education, specifically special education, needs accountability. We in Maryland were able to pass a law regarding accountability in the Education Act, but enforcing it is a different story, right? So you know this already.
Yeah.
We know where the problems are. How do we get enforcement on the legal side to proceed?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. One is making sure that there are folks in the office who are specifically tasked with enforcing this work, because then you have your point of contact. Things can kind of get lost when it's in a big office that does a lot of things. I think the other thing is really getting clear about what kind of information the office needs. When you're doing organizing and you're telling people stories, you don't have to satisfy a legal standard of evidence in order to share a story with the media, or in order to know something is happening. But knowing something is happening is different from being able to prove in court or in a legal document that it's happening. So I think it really takes a lot of collaboration with whatever the government agency is to say, what do you need to bring this case? And then helping them find folks who are able to share that information with them. And again, I'm happy, just open plug for folks to reach out to me if I can be helpful on specific issues or connections with government agencies. But I think a lot of it is kind of like finding that combination lock. You need to find the right information and the right people to make sure that it can be translated into a legal case, not just an organizing tool or a communications tool.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I hope that's helpful. And I think that we've got some links to your Twitter at the very least in the chat, so people can really reach out to you. I just got a couple more questions for you. Someone asks, other than workers' rights, what are the big areas that you see as critical for a big enforcement push?
Yeah. I think housing is a huge issue, as everyone knows, with the housing affordability crisis across the country. There are just huge incentives for, especially as large venture funds take over housing, larger landlords, et cetera. There's just a lot of incentives for them to push tenants out so they can raise the rent. So tenant protection, housing conditions, that kind of enforcement, I think, is really, really important. And then I think police accountability is just really hard to overlook. As you know, every week there is a new episode of police violence, and those are just the ones that we see on camera that go viral. That's not the daily experiences that happen behind the scenes, particularly for Black communities and communities of color. So I think police accountability and civil rights investigations of police departments, I think, are really important. Even, again, this is something we always often think of the federal government, but a lot of state AGs can do this work. And where they can't, actually policy advocacy to give them authority and push them to do this, I think, is really important. The Obama administration really prioritized police accountability, and at their height, they were doing like maybe 5 investigations a year, 3 to 5.
Wow.
So this is not a problem the federal government can solve on its own. We need to get states and cities involved.
Well, that's a great segue to, I think, a big question I'm going to pose it in sort of 2 parts. So we're part of this amazing Ashoka community, and our tagline is "Everyone a change maker." So an attendee asked the question, what can ordinary citizens do to help government along with enforcement? And that's a really, really important question. But I want to pair it also with, this community. You have a unique approach that I think enables others to participate in the kind of change that you want to see. So how is this sort of a big tent? And whether you do this for a living or you do this as just part of your, commitment to civic life, how do you want other people to show up for this? Yeah.
So I want to say the majority of ordinary citizens have experienced the kind of enforcement gap that we talk about. We, in research that we did in 2019, over 50% of Americans have experienced illegal corporate abuse in some way, whether that's predatory lending, wage theft, unsafe housing, all of those sorts of things. And so I would just encourage you, if you have experienced those things, to find your DA, your attorney general, your city attorney, and actually file a complaint and help others who may be experiencing the same problems that you have, but might not have the resources or access to information that you have in order to make that complaint. And so just want to say that is something that everyone can do who has experienced any of these issues. I think another thing that people can do is just educate yourselves and help others, share this information with advocates and other ordinary citizens. So you can follow us on Twitter at Public Rights. We have a newsletter that shares a lot of information about our cases called Represented. So if you go to publicrightsproject.org, you can sign up for our newsletter and learn more. Pay attention to your local DA's races. If there's an election coming up for your DA, for your mayor, for your city council, ask them what they're going to do about enforcing laws that are already on the books in their communities. And especially for DAs, a lot of the focus for DAs is on criminal prosecution of street crime, and a lot of the prosecutions that have fueled mass incarceration. There's an opportunity for DAs to actually shift some of those resources to the laws that are actually under-enforced, like wage theft, like fraud, like environmental crime. So anywhere in the country, you can ask your DA, your candidates for DA, what they're going to do about enforcement of those laws.
And what about others in the Ashoka community? Do you see roles for them?
Absolutely. I think if you I mean, so many folks in the Ashoka community are advocates in one way or another. So you can shine a light on this delivery gap and enforcement gap issue and make sure that when thought leaders, when policymakers, when change makers are considering policy change, that they're thinking it through to the end of the story, not just the Schoolhouse Rock end of the story. So I think there's a huge role for the Ashoka community to play in really educating the public and the advocacy community about the importance of implementation and enforcement, to make sure that when we set out to change our policies and our government, that we're actually seeing it through.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to give you one last question. What's
Yeah.
your ambition for Public Rights Project? Like, when does it win? When have you won?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think for us, what we want to do is we want to take equitable enforcement and move it from an extracurricular activity of state and local government to a core function of state and local government.
Yeah.
So we will win when every community across the country has an enforcement unit that is dedicated to equitable enforcement. And I think the equitable enforcement piece is really important, because we've all seen when enforcement goes wrong. We think of law enforcement, we think of over criminal prosecution, mass incarceration, and those sorts of things. So we need core function of government to be equitable enforcement of laws that protect the building blocks of people's safety and well-being. And that's what we're trying to shift. We're in 80 governments across the country, and we have a couple thousand more to go. So
great.
Where we're headed.
Well, I hope this becomes very much more of a group effort, and it can see from the questions that it already is. But let's grow this movement, because it's so important. This has been delightful. It's wonderful to get to catch up with you. It is wonderful to hear more about how the work is growing, how it really makes a difference for people in their real lives. This is about actual change, not change on paper. So I want to thank you and thank all the team at Public Rights Project, and Amy Clark and the others at Ashoka, who did such a wonderful job of bringing us together and letting us talk with bunches of other people. And
yes.
Everybody has a lovely day.
Thank you so much, Jen. It was so great to talk to you as always. So I appreciate you.
Congratulations on everything, Jill.
Thank you.